London, 1815. The ninth move was her favourite. Miss Jane Fairchild had discovered over years of chess tutelage that it was in this moment, after the opening gambits were established, after the knights had pranced into position and the pawns had committed to their advances, that one could truly assess an opponent's mind. The ninth move revealed character. "Your bishop seems imperilled, Miss Fairchild," remarked 7-year-old Lord Thomas Montclair, his golden curls catching the afternoon light that streamed through the high windows of Montclair House's nursery. "Does it?" Jane replied, affecting surprise as she examined the board. "How astute of you to notice, my lord." In truth, Jane had deliberately positioned her bishop in jeopardy, testing whether the young lord would recognize the opportunity. She felt a rush of pedagogical pride when he did. Thomas was proving to be a far more capable student than most children of the aristocracy she had encountered in her for years as a governess. "I believe," the boy continued with the grave seriousness only children can truly master, "that I shall capture it forthwith." "Forthwith?" Jane's eyebrow arched. "Have you been reading Sir Walter Scott again when you ought to be practicing your French verbs?" Thomas grinned, revealing a gap where a tooth had recently departed. "Perhaps," he conceded. "But you said a gentleman must be well read." "So I did." "Very well then. Capture my bishop forthwith, if you must." The boy reached across the board with decisive confidence, then hesitated, his hand hovering over Jane's piece. His brow furrowed. "Wait," he murmured. "This feels rather too easy." Jane maintained an impassive expression, though inwardly she beamed. Thomas was learning to spot the trap beneath the temptation, a lesson as valuable in life as in chess. It was at this precise moment that the library doors opened, and His Royal Highness, Prince William Montclair, Duke of Kensington, strode into the room. Jane immediately rose and curtsied deeply. "Your Highness," she murmured, eyes appropriately downcast as protocol demanded. "Father!" Thomas exclaimed, momentarily forgetting his chess dilemma. "Miss Fairchild is teaching me to be cunning." "Is she indeed?" The prince's voice was deep and resonant, carrying the authority of his royal position but tempered with a warmth reserved for his son. "An unusual skill for a governess to impart, wouldn't you say, Miss Fairchild?" Jane straightened, meeting the prince's gaze with measured composure. "I believe cunning, when paired with integrity, Your Highness, is simply strategy. And strategy serves a gentleman well in all aspects of life." Prince William's mouth quirked slightly at one corner, not quite a smile, but certainly an acknowledgement. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing in his perfectly tailored navy coat, his chestnut hair styled in the fashionable windswept manner. Though only 32, responsibility had etched fine lines at the corners of his eyes that were now studying Jane with unexpected interest. "An intriguing philosophy," he said, moving closer to the chess table. "And what strategy has my son employed against you thus far?" "He very nearly fell into my trap, father," Thomas declared proudly. "But I sensed it just in time." "Did you now?" The prince's attention shifted to the board, his gaze sharp and analytical. Jane had heard rumors of his tactical brilliance during his military service. "Ah, I see it." The bishop sacrifice would have drawn his knight forward, leaving his queen vulnerable to your rook 3 moves hence. Jane couldn't mask her surprise. "You play, Your Highness." "When affairs of state permit," he replied. "Though it has been some time since I found a worthy opponent." There was something in his tone that sent a completely inappropriate flutter through Jane's chest. She reminded herself sternly that she was but a governess, employed to shape the mind of his son, not to engage in chess matches or conversation with the prince himself. The death of Princess Charlotte 2 years prior had made him a widower, but he remained firmly beyond the reach of someone of her station. "Perhaps you could play with Miss Fairchild sometime," Thomas suggested brightly. "She beats me nearly always." "Thomas," Jane admonished gently. "His Highness has far more important matters to attend to than chess games with your governess." The prince tilted his head, studying her with renewed interest. "Do not be so quick to dismiss the idea, Miss Fairchild. I find that chess reveals more about a person's character than hours of conversation. Then I must decline most fervently, Jane replied with a small smile. For a lady must maintain some mysteries. Prince William laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his solemn features. Well parried, Miss Fairchild. I see my son is in capable hands indeed. He turned to Thomas. I've come to invite you for a ride, if your studies are concluded for the day. The boy looked questioningly at Jane, who nodded her permission. Your mathematics is complete, and your French verbs await you tomorrow. Thomas leapt up from his chair, chess momentarily forgotten in the excitement of horsemanship with his father. May we ride to the stream, father? I want to show you how I can jump the narrow part now. If Miss Fairchild thinks you've earned such a privilege, the prince replied, deferring to Jane's assessment in a way that surprised her. He has been most diligent this week, Jane confirmed. Though perhaps avoid the wider crossings. The rains have made them treacherous. Prince William nodded. Sage advice, as one would expect from you. His eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed. Perhaps you might join us? The fresh air would be beneficial after being confined to the nursery. Jane hesitated. Such an invitation was unprecedented. In the 6 months she had served at Montclair House, the prince had been largely absent, attending to affairs of state in London. Their interactions had been limited to passing greetings in corridors or brief exchanges regarding Thomas's education. I thank you for the kind invitation, Your Highness, but I have correspondence to attend to, she replied, though the thought of an afternoon ride through the lush spring countryside was desperately tempting. Lady Harriet's French exercises await my corrections. Another time, perhaps, he said. Something in his expression suggested he would not forget the declined invitation. As the prince and Thomas departed, Jane remained by the chess table, her fingers absently tracing the carved knight's head. There had been something in William Montclair's gaze that unsettled her, a focused intensity that seemed to peer beyond her carefully maintained governess facade. It would not do to dwell on such things. Jane had learned long ago that romantic notions were luxuries that governesses could ill afford. She was fortunate to have secured a position in a royal household, with a generous salary that allowed her to support her ailing mother in Bath. Prince William's momentary interest was surely nothing more than appreciation for anyone who showed genuine care for his son's development. Yet as Jane carefully returned the chess pieces to their velvet-lined box, she couldn't help but wonder what it might be like to match wits with the prince across the checkered battlefield. ****, you've transformed my son, Prince William remarked 3 weeks later, startling Jane as she supervised Thomas's watercolor attempts in the conservatory. Lady Millicent insists he is a different child from the sullen boy she encountered last Christmas. Jane turned to find the prince observing them from the doorway, looking less formal than usual in a riding coat and buckskins. She curtsied quickly. Children often progress in spurts, Your Highness. I can claim little credit for natural development. False modesty doesn't become you, Miss Fairchild, he said, approaching to examine Thomas's painting of the estate's south gardens. My aunt is not easily impressed, yet she spent half an hour extolling your virtues yesterday. I believe she used the words miraculous transformation. Aunt Millicent said Miss Fairchild is a diamond of the first water, Thomas piped up, mixing more green for his foliage. Though I don't understand how water has diamonds. Jane felt a flush creeping up her neck. Lady Millicent is most kind, but exaggerates greatly. I find her assessment accurate, Prince William replied. He lowered his voice so only Jane could hear. Though diamond hardly captures the complexity I've observed. Before Jane could formulate a response to this improper compliment, Thomas tugged at his father's sleeve. Father, will you stay for our Shakespeare reading? Miss Fairchild does all the voices, even Falstaff. The prince's eyebrows rose in amusement. Falstaff, is it? Henry IV seems advanced material for a 7-year-old. Miss Fairchild says great literature shapes great minds, Thomas declared with the certainty of quoting a frequently heard maxim. And she explains the difficult parts. Indeed. William's gaze returned to Jane, a new respect evident. Most governesses would confine their charges to simple moral tales. Jane straightened her shoulders. Most governesses underestimate children's capacity for understanding, Your Highness. Thomas grasps more than many adults I've encountered. I've no doubt of that. The prince's expression softened as he regarded his son. I find myself unexpectedly at leisure this afternoon. I should very much like to hear Miss Fairchild's Falstaff. And so, to Jane's astonishment, the Prince of England settled himself in a wicker conservatory chair to listen as she read from Henry IV, Part 1. She began tentatively, acutely aware of his scrutiny, but soon lost herself in the beloved text. When Falstaff's lines approached, she deepened her voice to a rumbling basso and adopted the blustering cadence that always delighted Thomas. What, art thou mad? Art thou mad? Is not the truth, she boomed, gesturing dramatically with her free hand. Thomas dissolved into giggles, as he always did, but it was the prince's reaction that caught Jane off guard, a rich, unrestrained laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes and revealed a dimple in his left cheek. Remarkable, he said when she paused. I've seen that performed at Drury Lane with less conviction. Jane closed the book, suddenly self-conscious. I fear I've made a spectacle of myself, Your Highness. On the contrary, Miss Fairchild. You've revealed yet another talent. His expression grew thoughtful. You are wasted in the nursery. The statement hung between them, laden with implications that Jane dared not examine too closely. I find great fulfillment in teaching, she replied carefully. Not everyone would agree that shaping young minds is a waste of talent. A fair rebuke, he acknowledged with a slight bow of his head. I misspoke. What I meant to say was that your talent seemed to extend far beyond what your position requires. The best governesses, Jane said, bring all their faculties to bear on their responsibilities. Thomas deserves nothing less. The prince studied her with that same penetrating gaze that had disconcerted her during their chess encounter. No, he does not. Nor do you deserve less than full recognition of your capabilities. He rose from his chair. I find myself curious about your background, Miss Fairchild. Were you educated at a particular institution? Jane hesitated. Her unusual education was not something she typically discussed. My father was a professor of literature at Oxford, Your Highness. He believed daughters deserved the same educational rigor as sons. A progressive thinker, William observed. And clearly an effective teacher. The best I've ever known, Jane replied softly. The grief of her father's passing 2 years prior still lingered. It was his death and her mother's subsequent illness that had necessitated Jane's entry into employment. Something in her tone must have communicated her loss, for the prince's expression softened. You honor his memory through your work with Thomas. The unexpected kindness in his voice threatened to unravel Jane's composure. She turned her attention back to Thomas, who was adding details to his watercolor, blissfully oblivious to the currents of adult conversation. Your Highness, came a voice from the doorway. The prince's valet stood at attention. Lord Pembroke has arrived for your meeting. William nodded. I'll be along shortly. As the valet withdrew, he turned back to Jane. It seems duty calls. But I would be pleased if you and Thomas would join me for dinner this evening. Lady Millicent will be present as chaperone, he added, anticipating Jane's hesitation. Such an invitation was unprecedented. Governesses did not dine with their employers, particularly not royal ones. I'm honored, Your Highness, but I insist, he said, his tone gentle but firm. Thomas should learn to engage in adult conversation at dinner, and your presence will ease the transition. Put that way, as a matter of Thomas's education rather than a personal invitation, Jane found herself unable to refuse. As you wish, Your Highness. After he departed, Jane sat very still, her mind racing. In 6 months of employment, she had never been invited to dine with the family. Something had changed in the prince's perception of her, and while the attention was flattering, it was also dangerous. Governesses who attracted notice often found themselves the subject of servants' gossip, or worse, dismissed for presumption. Miss Fairchild. Thomas's voice broke into her thoughts. Are you well? You look peculiar. Jane composed herself quickly. Perfectly well, my lord. Now, shall we add some birds to your scene? Every garden needs inhabitants. As she guided Thomas's brush, Jane resolved to maintain absolute propriety at dinner. She would be pleasant but reserved, focused entirely on facilitating Thomas's participation. Whatever interest the prince had developed in her, intellectual curiosity, she told herself firmly, would surely fade when confronted with her deliberate dullness. She ignored the small voice inside that hoped it wouldn't. Dinner proved to be an exercise in contradictions. Jane arrived in her best gown, a modest blue silk that had belonged to her mother in better days, to find an intimate setting rather than the formal affair she had anticipated. The prince, his elderly aunt Lady Millicent, Thomas, and herself were the only diners, seated at a small round table in what William referred to as the family dining room, though it was still grander than any dining room Jane had ever seen. Miss Fairchild, Lady Millicent greeted her warmly. How delightful to have you join us. William has been singing your praises all afternoon. Jane curtsied deeply to the formidable dowager. You are too kind, my lady. I'm honored to be included. Nonsense, Lady Millicent waved a bejeweled hand. Anyone who has managed to interest Thomas in something beyond frogs and mud puddles deserves recognition. I understand you've introduced him to Shakespeare and chess. And astronomy and Latin and drawing and botany, Thomas interjected excitedly. Miss Fairchild knows everything. Prince William, who had risen at Jane's entrance, smiled at his son's enthusiasm. Not quite everything, I'm sure, though her knowledge does seem remarkably comprehensive. A necessity for a governess, Jane demurred, taking the seat a footman held out for her. One must stay at least one lesson ahead of one's pupil. How refreshingly modest, Lady Millicent remarked. Most young women of accomplishment in London these days chatter endlessly about their talents. I find it exhausting. The dinner proceeded with surprising ease. Lady Millicent, despite her forbidding reputation, proved to be an engaging conversationalist with progressive views on female education that aligned closely with Jane's own. The prince, meanwhile, directed much of the conversation toward Thomas, encouraging him to share his recent lessons and listening with genuine interest to the boy's observations. Jane began to relax, offering occasional comments and guidance when Thomas's enthusiasm outstripped his ability to explain clearly. It was during a lively debate about whether Roman or Greek mythology contained more interesting stories that she noticed the prince watching her with quiet intensity. What is your assessment, Miss Fairchild? He asked when she fell silent. You've been guiding Thomas's answers admirably, but have offered no opinion of your own. Jane glanced at Thomas, who was eagerly awaiting her response. I find merit in both, of course, but the Greeks captured the human condition with greater nuance. The Roman adaptations often simplified the moral complexities. Precisely my thinking, the prince nodded approvingly. Though I admit I'm partial to Ovid's treatment of transformation narratives. The Metamorphoses contains unparalleled poetry, Jane agreed, then caught herself engaging too eagerly. Though my knowledge is limited to translations, of course. Which translation do you prefer? William pressed. Dryden's or Golding's? It was a test, Jane realized, though whether of her knowledge or her honesty, she couldn't determine. Neither, Your Highness. I find Sandy's rendering most faithful to the original. Prince William's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. You read Latin, Miss Fairchild? Jane hesitated. Ladies were not supposed to study classical languages, it was considered unnecessary and potentially corrupting. But she had already revealed more than was prudent. My father believed translation is always interpretation. He insisted I learn enough Latin to verify the accuracy of the English renderings. Extraordinary, William murmured. And do you find most translations lacking? They reflect their translators' biases, Jane replied carefully. Dryden softens the violence, Golding emphasizes the moral lessons. The original text allows more ambiguity. A smile spread across the prince's face, not the polite, measured expression he typically wore, but something genuine and warm. Ambiguity. Yes, exactly. The Romans borrowed the gods but stripped away the contradictions that made them compelling. For a moment, Jane forgot the vast gulf of rank between them. Like Jupiter's transformation into a swan to pursue leader, the English translations render it a seduction, but the original, she stopped abruptly, mortified. Such topics were entirely inappropriate for the dinner table, particularly with a child present. To her relief, Lady Millicent merely chuckled. "I see why you've retained this one, William. A governess who understands the difference between education and indoctrination is worth her weight in gold." "Indeed she is," the prince agreed, his gaze still fixed on Jane. "Though I suspect Miss Fairchild would dispute being retained like a possession." Jane's cheeks warmed. "I am gratefully employed, Your Highness. And we are fortunate to have secured your services," he replied. "Though I wonder if we are making full use of your capabilities." Before Jane could respond to this puzzling statement, Thomas yawned widely, prompting Lady Millicent to declare it was well past the child's bedtime. As Thomas reluctantly bid the adults good night, the prince rose from his chair. "I'll accompany you both upstairs," he announced. "I've neglected my paternal duty of bedtime stories of late." This was unprecedented in Jane's experience. The prince visited Thomas daily when in residence, but bedtime routines had always been her domain. She followed a few paces behind as father and son ascended the grand staircase, discussing which story would be selected for the evening. At the nursery, Jane prepared to excuse herself to give them privacy, but the prince surprised her again. "Won't you join us, Miss Fairchild? I'm told your storytelling abilities far exceed my own." "Oh yes, please stay," Thomas pleaded. "Father does the voices all wrong." William feigned offense. "I'll have you know my Toad of Toad Hall was highly praised by your cousins." "That's because they've never heard Miss Fairchild's version," Thomas replied confidently. And so Jane found herself perched on a chair beside Thomas's bed, listening as the Prince of England attempted to read the tale of Peter Rabbit with dramatic flourish. His performance was endearing in its earnestness, though Thomas was right, his voices needed refinement. When Thomas's eyes grew heavy, William leaned down to kiss his forehead. "Sleep well, my boy. Perhaps Miss Fairchild will give me lessons in proper storytelling tomorrow." Jane escorted the prince to the nursery door, expecting him to bid her good night. Instead, he paused in the corridor. "Would you walk with me a moment, Miss Fairchild? The gardens are particularly lovely in the evening light." Every instinct warned Jane to decline. Proper governesses did not take twilight strolls with their employers, especially royal ones. Yet something in William's expression, a vulnerability beneath the confidence, made refusal difficult. "Just to the terrace and back," she compromised. "I should return to check on Thomas shortly." The prince nodded, seeming to understand her caution. They descended the stairs in silence and stepped out into the mild spring evening. The formal garden stretched before them, roses nodding in the gentle breeze, the setting sun casting long shadows across manicured lawns. "I find myself at a disadvantage, Miss Fairchild," William said finally. "I cannot imagine how, Your Highness." "Can you not?" He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "You have had 6 months to observe me and form opinions, while I have only recently begun to know you." Jane maintained a careful distance between them. "I am merely your son's governess, sir. My opinions are of no consequence." "Yet you have them," he pressed. "I would hear them, if you'd be so kind as to share." It was a dangerous request. Honesty could cost her position, platitudes would insult his intelligence. Jane chose her words with care. "I believe you to be a devoted father who has been thrust into sole responsibility for your son's upbringing under tragic circumstances. You are conscientious in your duties to the crown, which often takes you away from Montclair House. When you return, you make every effort to compensate for your absence through focused attention on Thomas." The prince listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "A fair assessment, though limited to my paternal qualities. What of my character more broadly?" "That would be presumptuous, Your Highness." "I am explicitly requesting your presumption," he countered, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Consider it a royal command, if you must." Jane took a deep breath. "You present the face expected of you, dignified, controlled, authoritative. But there are glimpses of someone else beneath that facade. Someone who laughs at Falstaff and attempts silly voices for Peter Rabbit. Someone who notices when his son almost falls into a chess trap. William's expression softened. "You see a great deal, Miss Fairchild." "Observation is essential to effective teaching," she replied, suddenly uncomfortable with the intimate turn of their conversation. "Is that all it is? Professional observation?" Jane knew she was venturing onto dangerous ground. "What else could it be, Your Highness?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of sandalwood and leather that clung to his clothing. "I think, perhaps, it could be understanding. The kind that forms the foundation of friendship. Or something more." "Your Highness," Jane said quietly, taking a step back, "I am your son's governess. Any friendship between us would be inappropriate and would compromise my position." "And if your position were to change?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Jane dared not contemplate. "I should return to Thomas," she said, avoiding the question entirely. "Thank you for the dinner invitation and the pleasant walk, Your Highness." William studied her face for a long moment, then nodded, respecting her retreat. "Of course. But our conversation is not concluded, Miss Fairchild." Merely paused. As Jane made her way back to the nursery, her thoughts were in turmoil. The prince's interest seemed to extend beyond professional appreciation, yet any reciprocation on her part would be folly. The gap between their stations was unbridgeable. Even if his intentions were honorable, and she could not allow herself to assume they were, society would never accept a match between a prince and a governess. No, Jane decided firmly as she checked on the sleeping Thomas. Whatever had prompted the prince's sudden attention, she would maintain appropriate boundaries. Her position was too precious, her responsibilities to Thomas too important, to risk on what could only be a fleeting royal fancy. She ignored the small, treacherous part of her heart that had thrilled at William's words, at the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. Such sentiments were luxuries a governess could not afford. The next morning brought an unexpected complication in the form of a letter from Jane's mother in Bath. Mrs. Fairchild's health had deteriorated, and the physician recommended sea air. Could Jane possibly arrange a visit? The timing could not have been worse. Jane had no intention of abandoning Thomas in the midst of his education, yet her mother's need was urgent. She would have to request leave from the prince, a conversation she now dreaded after their loaded exchange the previous evening. She found William in his study after breakfast, poring over correspondence. He looked up at her knock, his face brightening in a way that sent an inappropriate flutter through her chest. "Miss Fairchild, I hoped you might join me this morning. There's a matter concerning Thomas's education I wish to discuss." Jane curtsied formally, maintaining more distance than was strictly necessary. "I must speak with you on an urgent personal matter as well, Your Highness." His expression grew concerned. "Of course. Please, sit down." Jane remained standing. "I've received word that my mother is unwell. The physician recommends sea air for her recovery. I must request a leave of absence to accompany her to Brighton for 2 weeks. "I see." William set down his pen, his brow furrowed. "When would you need to depart?" "As soon as possible, sir. Perhaps in 2 days, if arrangements can be made for Thomas's lessons during my absence." The prince was silent for a moment. "Thomas will be devastated. He has grown quite attached to you." "And I to him," Jane admitted. "But my mother has no one else." William nodded, his expression softening. "Family obligations must be honored. Of course you must go." He hesitated, then added, "As it happens, court business requires my presence in Brighton next week. Perhaps we might coordinate our travel arrangements." Jane stiffened. "That would be most improper, Your Highness." "Would it?" he challenged mildly. "If Lady Millicent were to accompany us as chaperone? Thomas could continue his lessons during the journey, and you would reach your mother more comfortably than by public coach." It was a reasonable suggestion, yet Jane hesitated. Traveling in the prince's company, even chaperoned, would fuel rumors among the servants. William seemed to read her thoughts. "I understand your concerns for propriety, Miss Fairchild. But consider, would it not be more improper to allow a gentlewoman to travel alone when safer alternatives exist? Put that way, refusal seemed churlish. If Lady Millicent agrees to accompany us, I would be grateful for the conveyance," Jane conceded. "Excellent." The prince's smile was perhaps too satisfied. "Now, regarding the matter I wish to discuss with you. I've been considering Thomas's education, and I believe he would benefit from more structured exposure to society." Jane tilted her head, puzzled by this abrupt change of subject. "He is rather young for formal society, Your Highness." "Not grand balls and dinner parties, of course," William clarified. "But cultural experiences, the British Museum, the Royal Opera, perhaps visits to historical sites. Education beyond books." "A worthy endeavor," Jane agreed cautiously. "I would like you to organize such outings," he continued. "As educational advisor rather than merely governess." Jane blinked in surprise. "Educational advisor?" "Yes." The position would entail broader responsibilities, designing a comprehensive educational program, selecting appropriate cultural experiences, engaging specialized tutors as needed. Thomas would still have a governess for day-to-day lessons, but you would oversee his entire educational development. The proposal was unexpected and oddly timed. "May I ask what prompted this consideration, Your Highness?" William leaned back in his chair, regarding her steadily. "Two things. First, I've observed that your talents exceed the traditional governess role. Second, I received a letter yesterday from Princess Caroline of Brunswick expressing interest in engaging your services for her daughter." Jane's breath caught. Princess Caroline, estranged wife of the Prince Regent, was known to recruit the finest governesses in England for her household. "How did the princess hear of me?" she asked, bewildered. "Lady Millicent mentioned your accomplishments to her sister, who corresponds with Caroline." William's expression was carefully neutral. "It's a prestigious offer, with a substantial increase in salary." "I see." Jane's thoughts raced. Such a position would provide greater financial security for her mother. Yet the prospect of leaving Thomas and Montclair House filled her with unexpected distress. "Before you consider accepting," William continued, "I wish to offer you the opportunity to remain here in an enhanced capacity. The educational advisor role would include a 50% increase in your current salary and private apartments in the East Wing rather than the nursery quarters." Jane studied him suspiciously. "This seems a rather sudden need, Your Highness." "Not sudden. Simply accelerated by circumstances." William rose from his desk, moving to stand near the window. "I've been contemplating Thomas's educational requirements for some time. Princess Caroline's interest merely forced me to formalize my plan sooner than intended." It was a plausible explanation, yet Jane sensed there was more to the prince's offer than professional consideration. The improved quarters, the enhanced title, these changes would effectively elevate her status within the household, placing her above the rank of servant. "I am honored by your confidence," she said carefully. "May I have some time to consider both opportunities?" "Of course." William turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. "Though I hope you will remember that Thomas would be devastated to lose you." "Only Thomas?" The question slipped out before Jane could stop herself. Something flickered in the prince's eyes, vulnerability quickly masked by composure. "I believe I would find your absence equally regrettable, Miss Fairchild." The admission hung between them, fraught with implications neither could openly acknowledge. "I shall give the matter serious thought," Jane promised, retreating toward the door. "And I will prepare Thomas for my temporary absence." "We depart for Brighton the day after tomorrow," William confirmed. "Lady Millicent has already agreed to accompany us." As Jane made her way back to the nursery, she couldn't help but feel that events were accelerating beyond her control. The prince's offer was generous, suspiciously so. Was it merely a countermove to Princess Caroline's overture, or was there something more personal motivating his sudden interest in restructuring her position? And why did the thought of leaving Montclair House permanently fill her with such inexplicable sadness? Brighton in early summer was a spectacle of fashion and frivolity. The Prince Regent had transformed the sleepy fishing village into the playground of the aristocracy, and even in the early season, the promenade teemed with elegantly dressed visitors taking the sea air. For Jane, however, the seaside resort offered little pleasure. Her mother's condition had improved with the change of climate, but remained precarious. The small cottage Jane had rented near the shore consumed most of her savings, and the physician's visit strained her finances further. "You mustn't worry so, my dear," Mrs. Fairchild said one morning, observing her daughter's furrowed brow as she calculated expenses. "I am much improved already." Jane forced a smile. "Of course you are, mother. The sea air works wonders." "Not nearly as much as having you here," the older woman replied. "Though I fear I've taken you from important responsibilities. How does your young charge fare without you?" "Thomas writes daily," Jane said, softening at the thought of the boy's earnest letters. "His new temporary governess is apparently the most frightfully dull and does not do the voices properly." Mrs. Fairchild chuckled. "High praise indeed. And what of his father? You've mentioned him rarely." Jane busied herself rearranging the flowers on the bedside table. "The prince has been most accommodating regarding my leave of absence." "Just accommodating," her mother pressed gently. "Your letters have been filled with Thomas's accomplishments, but curiously silent on the prince himself." "There is little to say," Jane replied, too quickly. "He is Thomas's father and my employer." Mrs. Fairchild studied her daughter shrewdly. "Jane, I have known you every day of your life. When you avoid a subject so deliberately, it invariably means there is a great deal to say." Jane sighed, sinking into the chair beside the bed. "It is complicated, mother. Matters of the heart generally are." "It isn't," Jane began to protest, then stopped herself. There was little point denying what her mother had already intuited. It cannot be a matter of the heart. The prince he is a prince. I am a governess. And yet? Mrs. Fairchild prompted. "And yet he has offered me a new position as Thomas's educational advisor. With increased salary, better quarters, and broader responsibilities." Her mother's eyebrows rose. "That seems a significant promotion." "It came immediately after he learned Princess Caroline wished to recruit me," Jane added. "I suspect it was merely a competitive response. Or perhaps he recognized your value and didn't wish to lose you to Princess Caroline or anyone else." Mrs. Fairchild reached for her daughter's hand. "Has he given you any other indication of particular regard?" Jane thought of the intense conversations, the lingering gazes, the twilight walk in the garden. Nothing that couldn't be interpreted as professional appreciation. "I see." Mrs. Fairchild squeezed her hand. "And what do you feel for him?" It was the question Jane had avoided asking herself. "Admiration," she admitted finally. "Respect. He is intelligent, devoted to Thomas, conscientious in his duties. And when he laughs, truly laughs, not the polite chuckle he uses at formal occasions, it transforms him entirely." Her mother smiled knowingly. "That sounds remarkably specific for mere professional appreciation." Jane withdrew her hand, rising to pace the small room. "It doesn't matter what I feel. Nothing can come of it. Even if there were mutual regard, society would never accept such a match." "Society accepts what it is presented with a fait accompli," Mrs. Fairchild countered. "History is filled with unlikely alliances that became acceptable once they were established facts." "Mother, please," Jane pleaded. "Don't encourage impossible fantasies. My focus must be on Thomas's education and your recovery." "And your own happiness," her mother insisted. "Your father and I raised you to believe you were worthy of the best life could offer. Don't let artificial constraints limit your expectations." Further discussion was interrupted by a knock at the cottage door. Jane excused herself, grateful for the reprieve from her mother's uncomfortable insights. She opened the door to find a liveried footman holding a sealed note. From His Royal Highness, the Prince of Kensington, he announced with a bow. Jane accepted the note with surprise. She had not expected to hear from William during their stay in Brighton. They had agreed it would be inappropriate for him to visit her mother's cottage. The note was brief, *Miss Fairchild, **, Thomas and I find ourselves at liberty this afternoon and would be pleased if you would join us for a promenade along the pier at 2 o'clock. Lady Millicent will accompany us. Thomas is most eager to show you his new telescope, purchased expressly for observing ships at sea. **, If your mother is well enough, she would be most welcome to join our party. **, yours **, William Montclair **, the signature, his name rather than his title, sent an inappropriate flutter through Jane's chest. The invitation itself was proper enough with Lady Millicent as chaperone, yet the yours seemed unnecessarily familiar. Who was at the door, dear? Mrs. Fairchild called from the bedroom. Jane returned, note in hand. An invitation from the Prince. He and Thomas wish us to join them for a walk along the pier this afternoon. Her mother's face brightened. How delightful! I'm certainly well enough for a short excursion, especially with your arm to lean on. Are you certain? Jane hesitated. The wind can be quite brisk on the pier. All the better for my lungs, Mrs. Fairchild insisted. And I confess I'm curious to meet this prince who has so carefully not featured in your letters. Jane recognized defeat when she encountered it. Very well. I shall send a reply accepting the invitation. As she wrote a brief note of acceptance, Jane couldn't help but wonder at William's motives. Was this merely an innocent excursion for Thomas's benefit, or was the prince deliberately manufacturing an opportunity to further their acquaintance outside the constraints of their professional relationship? And why, despite all her rational objections, did the prospect of seeing him again fill her with such treacherous anticipation? ****, the Brighton pier stretched into the sparkling sea like a jeweled finger, its wooden planks crowded with fashionable visitors promenading in the afternoon sunshine. At precisely 2 o'clock, Jane and her mother arrived at the designated meeting place, where William, Thomas, and Lady Millicent awaited them. Thomas spotted them first, breaking protocol to run toward Jane with excited disregard for propriety. "Miss Fairchild! I've missed you terribly. Miss Pennington is dreadful at geography and says I mustn't ask questions during lessons." Jane laughed, briefly embracing the boy before remembering herself and stepping back. "I've missed you too, Thomas. May I present my mother, Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild?" Thomas executed a perfect bow. "How do you do, Mrs. Fairchild? I am Lord Thomas Montclair. Are you feeling better with the sea air? Miss Fairchild said you were unwell." "Much improved, thank you," Mrs. Fairchild replied with a warm smile. "Especially now that I'm meeting the young scholar my daughter speaks of so fondly." William and Lady Millicent approached at a more dignified pace. The prince was dressed less formally than usual in a navy tailcoat and buff trousers, looking more like a country gentleman than a royal personage. The effect was both more approachable and, Jane admitted privately, more handsome than his usual formal attire. "Mrs. Fairchild," he greeted Jane's mother with a respectful bow. "It is a pleasure to meet you. Miss Fairchild's devotion to your care speaks highly of both your character and hers." Mrs. Fairchild curtsied as deeply as her frail health allowed. "Your Highness, you honor us with your invitation." "The honor is mine," William replied, before turning to Jane. His expression softened noticeably. "Miss Fairchild, you are looking well. The sea air agrees with you." It was a conventional pleasantry, yet something in his tone made it seem more personal. Jane curtsied, keeping her eyes appropriately lowered. "Thank you, Your Highness. Brighton has proved beneficial for my mother's health." "And for your complexion," Lady Millicent observed briskly. "You've acquired a most becoming glow, my dear. London pallor is fashionable but unhealthy, in my opinion." The elderly lady linked her arm through Mrs. Fairchild's. "You and I shall set a sensible pace, Mrs. Fairchild, while these younger folks dash about. I understand you were a professor's wife? I should like to hear about university life." My late husband always claimed Oxford dons were the most peculiar species of gentlemen in England. As the two older women fell into comfortable conversation, William offered his arm to Jane. "Shall we follow at a respectable distance?" Thomas is eager to demonstrate his telescope, but I fear he may require supervision to prevent him from toppling into the sea in his enthusiasm. Jane hesitated before placing her gloved hand lightly on his sleeve. Even this proper contact seemed dangerously intimate outside the formal setting of Montclair House. "I've received his letters about the telescope. He seems quite taken with astronomy." "An interest I believe you inspired," William replied as they began to stroll along the pier. Thomas skipped ahead, already training his brass telescope on a distant ship. "He speaks of little else lately, except perhaps your imminent return. Miss Pennington apparently lacks your gift for bringing educational subjects to life." "Thomas exaggerates my abilities," Jane demurred. "Miss Pennington is highly recommended and has an excellent understanding of traditional subjects." "Traditional, perhaps, but not innovative." William glanced down at her, his expression thoughtful. "Have you given any consideration to my offer? The educational advisor position?" Jane nodded. "I have thought of little else, if truth be told." "And your thoughts have led you to?" "Uncertainty," she admitted. "The position is generous, is more than generous. But I wonder at the timing and the motivation." William guided her around a group of boisterous young men, his hand briefly covering hers on his arm in a protective gesture that sent an inappropriate thrill through her. "You suspect ulterior motives?" "I suspect that Princess Caroline's interest prompted a hasty response," Jane replied carefully. They reached the end of the pier, where Thomas was excitedly tracking a fishing vessel through his telescope. William paused, turning to face her directly. "Princess Caroline's letter was indeed the catalyst," he acknowledged. "But not in the way you imagine. It forced me to recognize something I had been reluctant to acknowledge even to myself." Jane's heart quickened despite her best efforts at composure. "And what was that, Your Highness?" William's gaze was steady, unwavering. "That the prospect of you leaving Montclair House, of leaving Thomas and me, was utterly intolerable." The frank admission hung between them, too personal to be professional, too direct to be misinterpreted. "Your Highness," Jane began cautiously, "I am deeply committed to Thomas's education and welfare." "It is not only Thomas's welfare that concerns me," William interrupted softly. "When I saw you playing chess with him that first day, the patience in your guidance, the intelligence in your strategy, the genuine delight you took in his progress, I recognized something rare. Something I had not expected to find again after Charlotte's death." Jane's breath caught. This was dangerous territory, far beyond the bounds of appropriate employer-employee discourse. "I have observed you these past months," he continued when she remained silent. "Your kindness, your intellect, your principles. I have come to value your perspective on matters far beyond Thomas's education." "I am honored by your confidence," Jane managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I must remind you of our respective positions, or positions can change," William said simply. "Feelings, however, are less malleable." Before Jane could formulate a response to this extraordinary statement, Thomas bounded back to them, oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults. "Father! Miss Fairchild! I've spotted a three-masted schooner. Come see." He thrust the telescope toward Jane with endearing enthusiasm. The moment broken, Jane accepted the telescope with a smile that she hoped concealed her inner turmoil. "Show me where to look, Thomas." As the boy directed her gaze out to sea, Jane was acutely aware of William standing close beside her, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. His words echoed in her mind. Feelings, however, are less malleable. What precisely did he mean? And more troublingly, why did his implied sentiment resonate so powerfully with her own carefully suppressed emotions? The remainder of the excursion passed in a blur of polite conversation and Thomas's excited discoveries. Jane found herself simultaneously seeking and avoiding William's gaze, torn between the desire to understand the full meaning behind his words and the fear of what that understanding might compel her to acknowledge. As they parted at the end of the afternoon, William took her hand briefly in his. I hope we might continue our conversation soon, Miss Fairchild. There is much left unsaid. Jane withdrew her hand gently but firmly. Some things perhaps are better left unsaid, Your Highness. His expression grew serious. I have found that unspoken truths rarely remain dormant. They have a way of making themselves known, often at inconvenient moments. With that cryptic observation, he bowed and departed with Thomas and Lady Millicent, leaving Jane to escort her mother back to their cottage, her thoughts in disarray. A most impressive gentleman, Mrs. Fairchild remarked as they walked slowly along the promenade. I'm quite evidently smitten with you, my dear. Mother, please, Jane protested. The prince was merely being courteous. Jane Elizabeth Fairchild, her mother said with unexpected firmness. Do not insult my intelligence. That man looks at you the way your father looked at me for 30 years of marriage, as though you are the answer to a question he has been asking all his life. Jane had no response to this startling assessment. Could her mother be right? And if so, what possible future could there be for such impossible feelings? These questions haunted her through a sleepless night, as the sound of waves breaking against the Brighton shore echoed the tumultuous beating of her heart. ****. 2 days later, a note arrived from Lady Millicent requesting Jane's company for tea at her Brighton residence. The invitation made no mention of the prince or Thomas, but Jane suspected their presence was implied. She arrived at the appointed hour to find only Lady Millicent awaiting her in an elegant drawing-room overlooking the sea. My nephew and grandnephew are otherwise engaged this afternoon, the elderly lady announced after pleasantries were exchanged. Which suits my purpose admirably, as I wish to speak with you privately. Jane set down her teacup with trepidation. I hope I have given no cause for concern regarding Thomas's education, my lady. Lady Millicent waved away the suggestion. Quite the contrary. Thomas flourishes under your guidance. It is a different matter entirely that brings us together today. She fixed Jane with a penetrating gaze. I believe my nephew has developed a tendresse for you, Miss Fairchild. The blunt statement robbed Jane momentarily of speech. When she recovered, she managed only, Lady Millicent, I assure you, there is no need for assurances, the older woman interrupted. I have observed William's behavior these past months. I know him better than perhaps anyone living, having raised him after his mother's death. He has not looked at a woman with such interest since Charlotte. Jane clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Even if that were true, nothing could come of it. The disparity in our stations is significant but not insurmountable, Lady Millicent finished for her. William is royal, yes, but distantly so. He is a prince of the blood, but the throne will never be his. His position affords him certain freedoms that his more directly royal cousins cannot enjoy. Surely not the freedom to marry a governess, Jane countered. To marry a professor's daughter, Lady Millicent corrected. An educated gentlewoman of impeccable character whose father was a respected Oxford don. The distinction is meaningful, my dear. Jane shook her head in bewilderment. Are you suggesting you would support such an unsuitable attachment? I am suggesting, Lady Millicent said precisely, that I would support William's happiness. Charlotte's death left him a shell of himself. In the past 6 months, I have watched him come alive again in your company. That transformation is worth more than any number of advantageous political alliances. The Tun would never accept me, Jane protested. The Tun will follow the Regent's lead, Lady Millicent replied pragmatically. And the Regent is fond of William. If he blesses the union, society will fall in line, whatever their private opinions. She set down her teacup decisively. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The question that matters is not what society will think, but what you feel for my nephew. Jane stared out at the sunlight dancing on the waves, considering her response carefully. My feelings are inappropriate for my position, she admitted finally. Then perhaps it is the position that must change, rather than the feelings. Lady Millicent rose from her chair. William plans to return to London tomorrow on court business. He has asked that you and Thomas accompany him, if your mother's health permits. I shall remain in Brighton with Mrs. Fairchild until she is fully recovered. Jane looked up in surprise. "That is most generous, but I couldn't possibly leave my mother. Your mother and I have already discussed the arrangement," Lady Millicent said with a smile that suggested she was accustomed to orchestrating others' lives. "She agrees that Thomas needs you more urgently than she does at present, particularly with his studies. And she is quite capable of tolerating my company for a fortnight." Outmaneuvered, Jane could only stare at the elderly lady in astonishment. "You have been very thorough in your planning, my lady." "At my age, one learns not to waste time on unnecessary obstacles," Lady Millicent replied briskly. "The carriage will collect you tomorrow at 10. I suggest you use the journey to consider what future you wish for yourself, Miss Fairchild. Opportunities for genuine happiness are rare in this life. Only a fool would dismiss them over matters as trivial as social convention." As Jane departed Lady Millicent's residence, her mind was in turmoil. The conversation had forced her to confront possibilities she had deliberately avoided contemplating. Could there truly be a future where her feelings for William, feelings she could no longer deny, even to herself, might find legitimate expression? Or was she allowing herself to be drawn into a fantasy that could only end in heartbreak and ruined reputation? *****. The journey from Brighton to London proved less awkward than Jane had feared. Thomas's presence required her to maintain a facade of normality, focusing on his education rather than the undercurrents of tension between herself and the prince. William, for his part, was scrupulously proper in his behavior, treating her with warm courtesy that gave no outward indication of the charged conversation on the pier. Only occasionally, when Thomas was absorbed in watching the passing countryside, did his gaze linger on Jane's face with an intensity that sent colour rising to her cheeks. They arrived at Montclair House in London by early evening. Thomas, exhausted from the journey, was escorted to his chambers by his valet, leaving Jane and William momentarily alone in the entrance hall. "I trust you will find your quarters prepared to your satisfaction," William said formally, though his eyes conveyed warmer sentiments. "I've taken the liberty of having your belongings moved to the East Wing suite we discussed, the educational advisor's apartments." Jane's eyebrows rose in surprise. "But I haven't yet accepted the position, Your Highness." "Consider it hopeful anticipation on my part," he replied with a slight smile. "The quarters are yours regardless of your decision. The nursery rooms are hardly befitting someone of your capabilities." Before Jane could formulate a response, the butler approached. "Your Highness, Lord Manning has arrived for your appointment." William's expression flickered with barely concealed annoyance. "Thank you, Jeffries. Please show him to my study." He turned back to Jane. "Court business, I'm afraid. Might I call upon you tomorrow to continue our discussion?" "Of course, Your Highness," Jane replied, curtsying formally despite the warmth spreading through her at the prospect. As a maid escorted her to the East Wing, Jane marveled at the transformation in her circumstances. The educational advisor's apartments proved to be a gracious suite of rooms, a sitting room, bedchamber, and private bath, decorated in soothing blues and creams, with tall windows overlooking the garden. It was the accommodation of a gentlewoman, not a servant. The implied elevation in her status was both flattering and alarming. If she accepted William's offer, she would occupy an ambiguous position in the household, neither family nor staff, but somewhere uncomfortably between. Such ambiguity would fuel speculation and gossip, particularly if William continued to show her marked attention. Yet as Jane unpacked her modest belongings, she couldn't help but feel a treacherous spark of hope. Lady Millicent's extraordinary endorsement of a potential attachment between herself and the prince had undermined Jane's certainty that such feelings were entirely impossible. Could there be a future where her regard for William, and his for her, might find legitimate expression? Or was she allowing herself to be drawn into a fantasy that could only end in heartbreak? Jane had no answers as she prepared for bed in her elegant new quarters. But for the first time, she permitted herself to imagine possibilities beyond the constraints of her current position, possibilities that included the warmth she had glimpsed in William's eyes when he looked at her. The following morning, Jane resumed her duties with Thomas, who was delighted to escape the less engaging instruction of Miss Pennington. They were deep in a geography lesson about the Asian subcontinent when a footman arrived with a message. "His Highness requests your presence in the library at your earliest convenience, Miss Fairchild," the servant announced with a formal bow. Thomas looked up from his map. "Is father going to play chess with you finally, Miss Fairchild?" "He said he wanted to." Jane felt heat rise to her cheeks at the boy's innocent comment. "I imagine His Highness wishes to discuss your educational progress, Thomas. Please continue marking the major rivers of India while I'm gone." She found William in the library, standing by the window with a chess set already arranged on a small table. He turned at her entrance, his face brightening in a way that sent an inappropriate flutter through her chest. "Miss Fairchild. Thank you for coming." He gestured to the chess table. "I hope you don't mind the presumption, but I thought we might combine business with pleasure." Jane approached cautiously. "What business did you wish to discuss, Your Highness?" "Your decision regarding the educational advisor position," William replied, pulling out a chair for her. "And perhaps the resolution of our unfinished conversation in Brighton." Jane seated herself with deliberate composure. "Those seem separate matters." "Do they?" William took the chair opposite her. "I find them increasingly interconnected." He gestured to the chessboard. "White or black?" "Black," Jane decided, allowing him the first move. William advanced a pawn with methodical precision. "Have you considered my offer?" Jane countered with a pawn of her own. "I have thought of little else." "And your thoughts have led you to?" He developed a knight. Jane mirrored his move. "Concerns about the unconventional nature of the position. Educational advisor is not a standard role in noble households. Innovation often begins with unconventional choices." William captured her pawn. "Your reservations are professional, then?" "Not personal." Jane advanced her bishop, avoiding his gaze. "The personal and professional are difficult to disentangle in this instance." "Because of what I intimated in Brighton." His knight advanced aggressively. "Because of what Lady Millicent stated quite explicitly in Brighton," Jane countered, capturing his pawn. William paused, his hand hovering over a rook. "My aunt has spoken with you." "About me?" "About us," Jane clarified. "Or rather, about the possibility of an us that she seems to find less objectionable than I would have anticipated." A smile spread across William's face. "Aunt Millicent has always been my staunchest ally. Though I hadn't intended for her to address the matter quite so directly." "It was illuminating," Jane admitted, watching as he castled his king. "She suggested that your royal status is distant enough to permit certain freedoms. My royal blood is significant enough to provide privilege, yet distant enough to afford choice," William agreed, studying the board intently. "An unusual position, much like the one I've offered you." Jane captured his knight, sensing a shift in the game's dynamics, both the chess match and the larger game they were playing. "Why did you create this position, Your Highness?" "Truthfully." William looked up from the board, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Because I found myself falling in love with my son's governess, and I needed to create circumstances where that love might honorably be expressed." The frank admission stole Jane's breath. She had suspected, had hoped, but to hear the words spoken aloud was overwhelming. "Your silence suggests I've overstepped," William said quietly when she didn't immediately respond. "No," Jane managed finally. "Not overstepped. Perhaps accelerated beyond what I was prepared to hear." "Then allow me to retreat and advance more carefully." He moved his queen to safety. "When I first saw you playing chess with Thomas, I was struck by your patience, your intelligence, the genuine joy you took in his learning. As I observed you in the months that followed, those initial impressions deepened into profound respect and admiration." Jane advanced her rook, her hands trembling slightly. "Respect and admiration are appropriate sentiments for an employer." "Indeed. But they were merely the foundation." William countered her move, his voice softening. "I found myself inventing reasons to observe Thomas's lessons. I began timing my walks to coincide with yours in the garden. I discovered that your laughter could brighten even my darkest days at court." Jane's heart raced. "Your Highness, William," he corrected gently. When we speak of matters of the heart, I would have you use my name. William, Jane conceded, the intimacy of it sending warmth through her. What you describe is impossible. Difficult, he amended. Not impossible. The educational advisor position would place you in a different social category. After a suitable period, say, 6 months, our friendship might naturally deepen into courtship without raising undue scandal. Jane stared at him in astonishment. You have planned this most thoroughly. I've had ample time to consider all possibilities, he admitted with a rueful smile. What I could not anticipate was your response. Jane studied the chess board, using the game as a metaphor for their situation. You've placed me in check, she observed, moving her king to safety. Not intentionally, William replied, advancing his queen once more. I seek partnership, not victory. The word a partnership hung between them, laden with meaning. Jane looked up from the board to find William watching her with an expression of such naked hope that it stole her breath. I cannot deny that I have developed feelings that exceed the bounds of professional respect, she admitted finally. But I fear the consequences of acknowledging them. Your position, Thomas's future, my reputation, there is much at stake. All worthy considerations, William acknowledged. But set against them is the prospect of happiness. True, deep happiness of the kind I never expected to find again after Charlotte. He reached across the board, not to move a piece but to gently cover her hand with his. The kind I believe we might find together, if you are brave enough to try. The touch of his hand on hers sent warmth spiraling through Jane. She did not withdraw, though propriety demanded it. And Thomas? Have you considered how he would view such an arrangement? William smiled. Thomas adores you already. When I tentatively broached the subject of you becoming a more permanent part of our family, his only concern was whether you would still teach him chess if you became his mother. Jane's breath caught. His mother? Eventually, yes. William's gaze was steady, unflinching. That is my hope, Jane. Not merely that you will accept the position of educational advisor, but that in time, you might consider a more personal, permanent position in our lives. The directness of his aspiration, a future she had scarcely permitted herself to imagine, left Jane momentarily speechless. You need not answer now, William said gently, withdrawing his hand. Take the educational position. Give us time to explore these feelings properly, with the respect and decorum they deserve. If, after 6 months, you find your regard has cooled or the obstacles too great, we shall part as friends with no damage to your reputation. It was a generous offer, more than generous. Jane studied the chessboard, seeing in it a reflection of their situation, complex, strategic, with multiple possible outcomes depending on the choices made. Check, she said quietly, moving her bishop to threaten his king. William examined the move, his expression thoughtful. A bold strategy. But not checkmate. Not yet, Jane agreed. The game continues. William smiled, understanding her metaphor. Then I shall make my next move. He shifted his king to safety. I formally offer you the position of educational advisor to Lord Thomas Montclair, with all the responsibilities and privileges we have discussed. Do you accept? Jane took a deep breath, recognizing the significance of the moment. This was not merely a career decision but the first step on a path that could lead to places she had never dared to dream possible. I accept, she said finally. Both the position and the possibility of what might follow. The joy that transformed William's face was worth any risk, any potential scandal that might lie ahead. He captured her bishop, his eyes never leaving hers. Then the game continues, Jane Fairchild. And I look forward to every move. As do I, Jane replied, a smile spreading across her face as she advanced her queen. Though I believe this particular match is nearly concluded. Check and mate in 3 moves. William examined the board and laughed, the genuine, unrestrained laugh that had first captured her heart. Thoroughly outplayed. Thomas warned me you were formidable. Only when properly motivated, Jane replied, her smile deepening. As they reset the chess pieces for another game, Jane felt a sense of profound rightness settle over her. The path ahead would not be easy, society would question, gossip would circulate, obstacles would arise. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that happiness might be possible beyond the constraints she had accepted for so long. The game was indeed continuing. And while the outcome remained uncertain, Jane could not help but feel that victory, for both of them, was suddenly within reach. Epilogue. 6 months later, the Regent's drawing room at Carlton House glittered with candlelight and jewels, as the cream of London society gathered for the Prince of Kensington's birthday celebration. Jane stood at the periphery, her blue silk gown, far finer than anything she had ever owned, marking her elevated status as educational advisor to the royal household. The past 6 months had unfolded exactly as William had predicted. Her new position had placed her in an ambiguous social category, not quite family, yet far above servant status. She had accompanied the Prince and Thomas to cultural events, museums, and historical sites, always in a professional capacity yet increasingly treated with the deference afforded to a lady of quality. Whispers had circulated, of course. The Ton specialized in speculation. But with Lady Millicent's formidable support and the Prince Regent's apparent approval, even the most disapproving matrons had been forced to acknowledge Jane with at least superficial courtesy. "You appear deep in thought, Miss Fairchild," came William's voice from beside her. He looked resplendent in formal court attire, the gold braid on his jacket catching the light as he bowed. "I was reflecting on the unexpected journey of the past year," Jane admitted, curtsying in return. "From governess to educational advisor to whatever comes next." William's eyes softened. "And have you reached any conclusions about whatever comes next?" "Perhaps," Jane replied with a small smile. "Though this is hardly the venue for such discussions." "On the contrary," William countered, offering his arm. "I can think of no better setting for what I have in mind. Would you walk with me to the terrace? The night air is unusually mild for December." Jane placed her hand on his sleeve, aware of the curious glances that followed them as they made their way through the crowded drawing room. The past 6 months had seen their relationship evolve gradually from professional respect to acknowledged friendship to something deeper that, while never improper, had become increasingly difficult to disguise. The terrace was mercifully deserted, the other guests preferring the warmth of the ballroom to the crisp night air. Stars glittered overhead, and the formal gardens of Carlton House stretched into the darkness beyond. 6 months ago, William began without preamble, "I asked you to accept a position that would allow us time to explore our feelings with propriety and care." "I remember it well," Jane replied, her heart beginning to race. "Over a chess game, as I recall." "That game concluded with your victory," William reminded her with a smile. "But the larger match between us has continued. And I find myself hoping that tonight might bring a resolution satisfactory to us both." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Jane's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a ring, not ostentatiously royal, but elegant and distinctive, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds. "Jane Fairchild," William said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "when I saw you playing chess with my son a year ago, I knew you were extraordinary. What I could not have known then was how completely you would transform both our lives with your intelligence, your principles, your compassion, and your love." He took her hand gently in his. "The past 6 months have confirmed what I suspected from the beginning, that you are not merely an exceptional teacher but an exceptional woman, one whom I have grown to love deeply and irreversibly." Jane felt tears gathering in her eyes as William continued. "The Prince Regent has given his blessing. Lady Millicent has given hers with even greater enthusiasm. Thomas asks daily when you will officially become his mother. All that remains is your answer." He sank to one knee, still holding her hand. "Jane Elizabeth Fairchild, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, my princess, my partner in all things?" Jane looked down at this man, this prince who had humbled himself before her, this father who had trusted her with his son's mind and heart, this suitor who had patiently navigated the treacherous waters of society for the chance to love her openly. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching on the simple syllable. "Yes, William, I will marry you." he slid the ring onto her finger, then rose to his feet, drawing her into an embrace that, while still proper enough for a public terrace, communicated a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "You have made me the happiest of men," he murmured against her hair. "And I the happiest of women," Jane replied, drawing back to look up at him. "Though I imagine there will be those who find our match scandalous." "Let them gossip," William said with a dismissive smile. "The regent has approved, which means society will follow, however reluctantly. And those who truly know us will understand that we have found in each other something rare and precious." As if on cue, the French doors to the terrace opened, and Thomas bounded out, followed by a smiling Lady Millicent. "Did she say yes, father?" the boy demanded, practically vibrating with excitement. "Is Miss Fairchild going to be my mother now?" William laughed, lifting his son into his arms. "She has indeed said yes, and yes, she will be your mother, though you may need to practice calling her something other than to Miss Fairchild." Thomas considered this seriously. "Mother Fairchild?" "No, that sounds odd. Just Mother, I think. Or perhaps Mamma." "Which do you prefer?" he asked Jane earnestly. Jane smiled through her tears of happiness. "Either would be perfect, Thomas." Lady Millicent approached, satisfaction evident in her aristocratic features. "Well, it's about time. I was beginning to think I'd need to lock you both in the library until you came to your senses." "Your encouragement has been persistent, Aunt Millicent," William acknowledged with a wry smile. "Someone needed to push you past your ridiculous propriety," the elderly lady sniffed. "Life is too short for unnecessary delays when happiness is at stake." She turned to Jane, her expression softening. "Welcome to the family, my dear. You've always belonged here, from the moment William saw you playing chess with Thomas and realized you were the one." As they returned to the ballroom, where William would formally announce their engagement to the assembled guests, Jane reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From a governess with limited prospects to the future Princess of Kensington, soon to be stepmother to the boy she already loved as her own. It was not the future she had envisioned when she first entered Montclair House a year ago. But as William squeezed her hand reassuringly before making their announcement, Jane knew with absolute certainty that it was precisely the future she was meant to have. The game that had begun over a chessboard was indeed concluding. And in this match, there were no losers, only the sweet, satisfying victory of love recognized, acknowledged, and, at last, celebrated.